Reid, thanks so much for taking the time today.
No problem. Thanks for the invite, and it's a pleasure to be on.
Listen, I think I'd love to start with talking about your background and in the research and as a practitioner and that journey to where you're at today with the UFC.
Sure, yeah. All right. I mean, how far do we go back in a background? But I guess I'll just give a quick overview of kind of my undergrad and my master's before the PhD work, which is probably what we really want to get into. My undergrad was a degree called Health Science at Deakin University, where I majored in exercise science and nutrition and also biochemistry. Following that, I did a master's in dietetics, where I could then register as an accredited practicing dietitian in Australia, which is similar to a registered dietitian in the US. And I worked for 18 months prior to starting my PhD, which is where things kind of got interesting. So my PhD was based at the Australian Institute of Sport, which is like our Olympic training centre, so to speak. And my PhD focused on acute weight manipulation in Olympic combat sports, so essentially weight cutting in Olympic combat sports. And so I did that for about three and a half years. And then following my PhD, I secured a job with Gatorade Sports Science Institute in the US, at IMG Academy in Florida. So I relocated from Australia to the US, where I worked as a senior scientist with Gatorade Sports Science Institute. And so my research there focused more on team sports, US team sports, and we're starting to just some of the papers are coming out now. But we had one recently looking at resting metabolic rate in adolescent athletes. We've got a few in sleep. I believe one has just been published, and there's more to come looking at sleep. And then I worked with Gatorade for 2 years, and then was fortunate enough to throughout that time make some connections with the UFC Performance Institute in Vegas. Obviously, my PhD looking at weight cutting in combat sports lends itself well to not just Olympic combat sports, but MMA and other combat sports. So kind of got the introductions to the guys at the UFC PI. And then when they were setting up in Shanghai, they actually reached out to me and kind of headhunted me for the position to be the nutrition lead out in Shanghai. So after 2 years in the US, I relocated to Shanghai, where I've been for a year now, or just over a year, minus the COVID situation. So I haven't been there for the past kind of 4 months. But yeah, started in March last year. And I should just kind of say throughout this whole time, my whole life I've been an avid martial arts practitioner, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specifically, kind of obsessed with BJJ for the past 15 years or so. That's kind of what tied into my PhD work and the reason why I was so passionate about combat sports. Yeah, pretty much Jiu-Jitsu nerd, dietitian, PhD looking at weight cutting, Gatorade for 2 years, and now fortunate enough to be working with the UFC in Shanghai.
That's tremendous, and always amazing when experts have not only the passion and the knowledge for a topic or sport, but also we're an athlete in that sport themselves, which gives that extra lens. And if we talk about MMA fighters, combat sports, I mean, so many factors to consider in the physical demands and physical preparation of a sport like that. Can you walk us through, what some of those physical demands are for MMA fighters and the considerations for you as a performance nutritionist?
Yeah, so like the physical demands. So first of all, mixed martial arts combines like all the different martial arts, striking and grappling. So predominantly like boxing, kickboxing or Muay Thai, and then wrestling and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So it's really dynamic and really varied. There's a lot of not only kind of explosive movements, but also a lot of isometric movements going on. And for those who are unaware, UFC and MMA in general kind of follows this kind of structure with a competition format whereby there's 3 5-minute rounds with 1 minute in between. And then for bigger fights or championship fights, it's commonly 5 5-minute rounds. So it is an aerobic sport, made up of large chunks of kind of glycolytic anaerobic efforts. So it's quite challenging to train for, and fighters never quite know the way a fight's going to go. So they need to be, really strong, really explosive, but also super fit, both aerobically and anaerobically. And so then in terms of nutrition, we're trying to fuel all of these different kinds of, efforts throughout competition and throughout training, but also manipulate body composition throughout. So there's chronic body composition manipulations, just looking at muscle gain and fat loss. But then also the kind of the thing that differentiates combat sports and weight category sports from all the rest is the requirement to make weight, which is quite nuanced and requires a real pragmatic approach because, often to make weight, we're doing things which might be considered suboptimal outside of the weight making context. And so, yeah, it's quite challenging for new dietitians and new nutritionists who are, used to working with sports where it's all about staying well hydrated and well fueled. And, we don't want to lose weight too fast and we want to do everything optimally to keep the athlete as healthy as possible throughout the whole time. And, a lot of the time it's not possible, given the other pressures on the athlete to make weight and such.
Absolutely, and definitely want to dive into the making weight portion. Obviously, you guys are operating on such a knife's edge with being able to tread that line between body composition and being able to perform and recover. And when we talk about those, being able to fuel an athlete, your work that you've done talking about the resting metabolic rate in adolescent athletes, we see the popularity of MMA's massively on the rise around the world. Canada being one place in particular that it's definitely really popular. When we're looking at RMR in adolescents, what are some of the findings that you uncovered in doing some work there, and as well as with your adult professional fighters?
Yeah, so basically, in a nutshell, what we found with the studies that we did with GSSI with adolescent athletes was that the vast majority of existing equations, prediction equations for RMR, are not appropriate for adolescent athletes, and they're underestimating RMR by about 10%. I think was the kind of rough average between the equations. And when you combine the training loads of adolescent athletes with the requirements for growth, and then potentially the prescription of nutrition using equations that are suboptimal, it kind of lends itself to issues surrounding poor energy availability, and things like this. And then in terms of adult populations, certainly. And it's interesting because now that I work in China, it's kind of a different cohort to kind of your typical MMA athlete, which is generally from more Western countries or Westernized countries. But like in Western countries, you'll often find these athletes that are chronically existing in states of low energy availability and energy deficits. So, it's like this whole kind of need to maintain a lean, mean physique and aim for lower and lower weight divisions because everyone thinks they're getting a performance benefit from it. You end up with athletes that are, putting their bodies through the absolute ringer in terms of their training, but they're also in an energy deficit for 8, 12 weeks on end. And, we know from some of the work in other sports that this, is not good for health and performance and, hormone profiles and things like this. So, it's a big problem in MMA. However, interestingly, it's less of a problem I've noticed in China. Like they have less of a
Interesting
kind of appreciation of this stuff, and in terms of kind of long-term adherence to nutrition programs and this sort of stuff. So in China, it's kind of more like the athletes do what they do, for the vast majority of the time, and don't really think about the need to make weight until 2 or 3 weeks before the fight. Then they just starve themselves. So they're probably more aggressive in the acute stage, but less aggressive in the chronic stage. Which, who knows what's worse? Because, like, if we're using that example, the Chinese athletes aren't in these energy deficits for 12 weeks on end. So, maybe they're avoiding that damage at the expense of, a harder weight cut. But, I think the jury's still out on what's worse.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I was going to say what, the lesser of two evils there, which one might be the better route to go. And Reid, if we talk about screening for fighters, testing, things that you take into consideration, obviously, when you're at the UFC Performance Institute, but even maybe some comments on coaches training fighters and their local facilities and what might be available to them.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm in Shanghai. We do a whole variety of tests, kind of physical performance tests, which I think is not what you're alluding to. We'll get into the nutrition stuff in more detail, but the physical performance tests are kind of all the standard ones you would imagine. We do like VO2 maxes and anaerobic, 3-minute glycolytic bike tests and stuff like this, as well as I was mentioning mid-thigh pull and counter movement jumps and all this sort sort of stuff just to get a profile of the athlete. But in terms of kind of my department and what we focus on, the big ones we use is a DEXA scanner, which is widely available around the world now, just to get an idea of body composition and more specifically our weight division fit. So we can kind of, there's no way to fully determine the optimal fat-free mass for a particular weight division, but we think we've got a pretty good idea based on kind of some sound theory as well as what we see some of the high-level performers, presenting with. And so we can tell from after doing a DEXA body composition scan on an athlete whether they're fighting in the quote-unquote right weight division, and if they're not, either they're cutting too much weight and they could potentially go up a weight division and maybe perform better. And there's plenty of examples in the UFC of athletes who have done this, or conversely, which is more commonly the case, particularly in China, it's like these athletes could go down a weight division. We give them a body composition scan. We realize that they've got fat-free mass commensurate with the weight division below, and they're walking around just a little bit soft, a little bit too much body fat for that weight division, and then we can get some good numbers on whether they can actually move down or not. So we certainly use DEXA. I would say that's the most common measurement that we make use of, but we also do a lot of RMR measurements, and the RMR stuff is super interesting in terms of how much it changes what we do. I would say definitely not as much as the DEXA, and it's more out of interest. But there are certainly times where again, we've got an athlete who the DEXA might say that they could potentially go down a weight division, but they're right on a knife's edge. It's like either they're in the correct weight division, but maybe could put on a little bit of muscle, or we could drop them down a weight division. We do an RMR, we find they've already got a suppressed RMR, and then upon further investigation, maybe they've already been starving themselves for a few weeks or months, and they've struggled to lose weight in the past. So that's kind of some good, it's kind of objective and subjective information that can help dictate whether we would go down or not. So we routinely do RMRs. In terms of coaches working with fighters, I really think it's worth getting a DEXA scan done, at least once a year or something like this. And once you've got the body composition determined for an athlete, you can then go by the number on the scales in terms of are they losing body weight or not. That's fine. But I think in the beginning, getting an idea of their body composition so you can identify that weight division fit. And then once you've identified whether they're in the ballpark of the right weight division, maybe you don't need to get another DEXA unless they put on or lose significant muscle mass, which can often be determined just by looking at the athlete or by assessing strength in the gym and that sort of stuff. So I'd certainly encourage coaches to do that. And then in terms of kind of more soft assessments, I guess, general dietetic and nutrition assessments, just asking them about their general diet, weight changes in the past, also getting an idea of their kind of psychological like some athletes really love the challenge of weighing everything and stacking the numbers up and getting it all down pat, and these guys you can really challenge them with following a plan for a long period of time and maybe pushing the envelope a little bit in terms of weight division fit. But then other people, we all know these people that are just like they're superstar athletes, but they don't really want to think about anything else. They're not good at, following plans and this sort of stuff. So, getting an idea of kind of the psychology or the, I guess, the psychological hardiness of an athlete or their ability to follow a plan for a long period of time and whether they could even, kind of take up that challenge in terms of weight division fits. Weight division changes is probably a good idea. But that stuff's a lot less tangible and requires, a bit of experience with athletes and their nutrition. But I mean, roundabout way to get to a short answer, I think a DEXA is a good start for coaches and well worth the money.
Yeah, it's interesting that sort of, the mechanic versus the artist sort of approach of, one athlete, you can give all the metrics and all the detail and they thrive off that and it really motivates them. And if you gave the same plan to another athlete, it would almost, drive them crazy or lead to exaggerated stress responses and things like that. So that's really a great point there. And when you talk about RMR, is there a certain frequency that you would, use in a performance setting? And when we look at coaches in their local settings, some of these portable RMR devices, is there, are they an evidence-based method to be using in those spaces as well?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not familiar with all of the different technologies that are coming out to measure RMR. The ones that I've had experience with are kind of like the more, I guess, higher end ones. So
Yep.
like Cortex Met Analyzer, I believe it's called, is what we're using with UFC at the moment. In the past, with GSSI and also with our AIS, we use Cosmed Metabolic Cart, and these are all really great. I know there's like kind of handheld portable devices coming out now, and I would be very skeptical as to their validity. I know there was one, and I won't mention the name in case the manufacturers are listening and I get in trouble for it or whatever, but they claim it was like a pen that you breathe into, and they
Hmm.
say it can give you all this information. And when you're looking at it, like it's not bad for the RQ. Just looking at the ratio of kind of fats to carbohydrates, but
Hmm.
in terms of an actual RMR, I'm not
A lot of
sure.
error still.
And obviously, yeah, and obviously standardization is a big deal with body composition and RMR measurement. It's no good to say the pen is super portable, and then you pop it in somebody's mouth during the middle of the day after they've already trained. Like, that's not going to give you any useful information. You want to know, a true resting metabolic rate,
Hmm.
first thing in the morning, fasted, rested, that sort of thing.
100%. And, if we shift gears here, Reid, and talk a bit about your philosophy, your process when it comes to working with a fighter. You get a fighter in the institute, elite professional fighter. What's the philosophy, or what are some of the first things you're thinking of when you're about to work with these types of athletes?
Yeah, I mean, it's very different. Like the way we work in Shanghai compared to the way they work in Vegas and the way that we sometimes work in Shanghai when we get visiting fighters is quite different because, like, in Shanghai, we have a full-time academy where we're essentially 100% responsible for these athletes' development. So it's probably more like the college setting in the US. And so with the academy athletes, it's kind of a much more broader, not one size fits all. Like, we certainly tailor it to the individuals, but, it's more bucketed into groups of, you know, people need to gain weight, people need to lose weight, type thing. Like we bucket them into different approaches. So we might have 30 athletes and kind of 5 or 6 different quote unquote client types that we're thinking about.
Hmm.
And so with these guys, it's a much more broader brush stroke approach. And we tend to be more conservative in the beginning until we know more about the athletes. Whereas when we're working with an individual, we've got a visiting high profile fighter, everything's about super prescriptive, individualized, tailored to that specific athlete. So that's kind of top level. And again, with the individuals, we can tailor it more to their personality, their experience in weight cutting or nutrition in general. Other considerations is like so that kind of gives us an idea about how we're going to pitch it, whether it's more individualized, prescriptive versus more broad. Um, but then following on from that, in terms of working with fighters, what are the priorities going to be? Well, is it about generally when you speak to fighters who've got fights coming up, right? Because after fights, they all go missing and hit the buffet and go out partying for
Nice.
3 weeks. And the last person they want to speak to is a nutritionist. So generally, you're seeing these people when they've got a fight coming up in the next weeks or months. And then it's all about like how far off are they from weight? And ideally, they're not in this, disaster station where, the whole fight camp is essentially a fat camp where their number one priority is getting that weight down. So that's
Hmm.
the not ideal situation, but it happens more often than not where, you're just fueling them suboptimally and you're trying to make the best of a bad situation, but it's got to be done because they need to make weight. Versus you get a fighter who's, well within striking distance of their weight, and then you can talk about, okay, the nutrition approach is all about optimally fueling the athlete throughout the fight camp. And that's obviously a lot more fun, and you're less of the bad guy, but, it's probably 50-50 whether it's fat camp or fueling. In terms of where are we in fight camp? Is it, if we're 3 weeks before fight camp, but before the fight, then it's probably targeting more that acute weight loss and the weight cutting considerations. Um, versus if we're further out, then again, it's more about fueling and maybe chronic body composition changes or just performance fueling requirements. And yeah, and then of course, just to kind of put a bookend on this section, how you work with a person, it's going to be all about your previous experience working with that person. Nutrition's always about, taking into consideration athlete habits and their beliefs around nutrition. Yeah, and I think that kind of covers that.
100%. And, with so many different disciplines within MMA, various fighters may be working more on, or less on various disciplines. Where's the evidence base at the moment in terms of the energy demands for a training week, or the macronutrient requirements, whether it's carbohydrates, etc., for a professional fighter?
Yeah, I mean the evidence base isn't great in terms of actual fighting. I would say it's we're more kind of making I would say very good educated guesses based on literature which has looked at other sports. And if we think of it as like, I mean, it's essentially like a strength and power sport with a large anaerobic as well as aerobic, requirements. So it's kind of, it encompasses everything. But really, like the things that I'm thinking about with our guys, it's like number one, get energy right, and a close second is get protein right. If we're getting energy and protein in the ballpark, I think we're a long way towards getting it right. And then obviously what's left is your kind of ratio of protein to fat. And really, it's like taking this pragmatic approach with these guys. Generally, it's about hitting certain weight targets, and I really don't mind kind of the relative ratio of carbs to fat with these guys as long as it's all working. Like if they're training hard and they're feeling good and their weight's where it needs to be, or it's trending in the direction that it needs to be, and we're getting energy and protein right, I really don't care whether the remainder is 50-50 fat carbs, 40-60, 70-30. Like once you're kind of getting to the extremes, then I would query it. And certainly if athletes are, if we think that their energy intake and protein intake is where we want it to be, and they're not losing weight too fast and things like this, but they're complaining of fatigue, and we've kind of ticked all the other boxes, this is where I would then certainly be trying to get more carbohydrates in them. I would always lean more towards, more carbohydrates than more fat for sure, because obviously it's a, glycolytic sport, and the energy demands are high, and they're working at these high intensities. But again, if an athlete is eating a little bit more fat than maybe the textbook would say is optimal, but they're feeling great, they're training hard, everything's good, kind of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, with a lot of these guys.
Awesome. And then, Reid, when we get into this weight cutting time frame before a fight, obviously you've done a lot of work in this area, and a lot of different strategies that are used, and a lot of old school strategies hopefully dying out, but obviously I'm sure you see are still being used. Can you talk a little bit about that, manipulating body composition and weight cutting in MMA?
Sure. So maybe I'll touch on kind of our kind of best practice guidelines that we use, and then maybe we can talk about where people go wrong. So in terms of like the way to do it, and this is the way that I explain it to coaches and athletes, like I've given these presentations so many times, and this is kind of the way it always comes out. It's like you want to think about what is the body made up of, so what constitutes your body mass, and specifically what constitutes your body mass that you can actually manipulate. So obviously, like skin and blood and all this stuff contributes to body mass as well, but we can't consciously manipulate it. The things that we're going to manipulate is essentially going to be body fat, muscle mass, body water, and then one that people often don't think about is gut content. And then within body water, I would also kind of throw glycogen in there, because as I'm sure most of your listeners are aware that a large portion of stored glycogen is water. Mm-hmm. So then we want to think about, and this is what I talk to the coaches and athletes about, which of these can we manipulate short term versus long term. And so body fat and muscle mass we can change. You can't get significant changes, certainly in less than a week, and maybe several weeks. Even if you're absolutely starving yourself, you're going to lose 1 to 2 kilos of fat in a week potentially. And in somebody who's already lean and on the back of a few weeks or months of dieting, they're not even going to lose a kilogram of fat in a week, which comes down to that equals like 150 grams of fat per day, something like this. Whereas water, we can shift 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% of your body mass in a couple of hours. And like athletes, particularly in team sports that train outside, routinely do this in training sessions. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of gut content, and this is the way I explain it to people, is like, when we go to the toilet, we're expelling undigested, food like plant matter, fiber, and so at any one period of time, you might have, and this varies depending on your habitual fiber consumption, but in our experience, in terms of how much weight people lose from adopting a low fiber diet, it seems that people are storing 1 to 2, maybe a little bit more percent of their body mass in undigested, food stuff sitting in their gut at any one time. So this is weight
Wow.
loss that we can take advantage of. And in the past, a lot of people will make use of like laxatives or bowel preparation formulas to just blast it out. Alternatively, people just don't eat for three days or so, and if you don't eat, you kind of pass all that's in your gut, and then you're left empty. The disadvantage to all of this, of course, is that number one, a bowel preparation formula or a laxative doesn't feel great. And like for an MMA fighter, if you've got about 30 hours between weighing and competition, maybe you recover before then. But certainly for the Olympic combat sports that are weighing in the night before competition or the morning of competition, you don't want to be taking a laxative, 6 hours before you compete. So a smarter way is just to adopt a low fiber diet. And so there's some kind of indirect evidence in some of the work that we've done. And then also in the clinical literature, looking at low fiber diets versus bowel preparation formulas. And it seems you can get the same weight loss and cleansing of the bowel from the adoption of like a 2 to 4 days of a low fiber intake as you would from taking a bowel preparation formula or a laxative. So that's one thing. So we've talked about kind of the water manipulation, and then we talked about like the bowel emptying via a low fiber diet, and then the last bit is the glycogen depletion. So just avoiding carbohydrates while still persisting in training. And so this is the way that we do it, just to kind of throw this all together. Depending on how far off weight the fighter is and what their kind of taper looks like, we'll kind of start the official weight cut, anywhere from kind of 7 to 9 days out.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first thing that we do is just cut carbs. So we might, and again, the research says that maybe you can deplete glycogen in a couple of days, like, I mean, maybe even in a day if you're going to, do several hours of, endurance exercise. But the thing is, these guys are tapering in that last week, and we don't really want to be encouraging extra exercise if we can help it. So we'll essentially do low carb or close to no carbs for, the earliest we would do it is probably 7 to 9 days out. Some guys will push it up until 3 or 4 days before because their weights are tracking pretty well.
Yep.
And during this time, it's a lot of like high fiber foods and high water content foods, this sort of stuff to help the athlete feel full. And we can actually increase the fat intake in this stage. So we're no longer kind of targeting those fat losses. So we can actually have them eating to maintenance, maybe even higher. So often it's very counterintuitive to people that during the weight cut, this is the first time during their fight camp they've actually been adequately fueled in terms of calories. And that's because we're no longer targeting body fat losses. So we're getting rid of the carbohydrate stores, and then maximum 4 days, minimum kind of 2 days, but average about 3 days out, we're going to cut fiber. And so we cut fiber, and essentially what the diet ends up looking like then is if you're not taking in any fiber and any carbohydrates, it's kind of a, in lieu of a better term, like a keto-looking diet,
Mm-hmm.
or I guess like a modified Atkins or something like this. It's just high protein, high fat, and a lot of fat. And with our athletes in Shanghai, we've tried to, get the kind of one size fits all approach where, instead of giving everyone a specific super prescribed diet, which maybe they will or won't follow, we just kind of want to give them guidelines. So we're just saying, don't eat this, eat this. And we actually encourage them to eat a lot of fat. So, the amount of nuts and peanut butter and stuff these guys are eating in that last couple of days.
They must love it.
Yeah. And then the final thing is getting rid of the water. So with some of our guys, maybe they lose 3 to 4% of their body mass from cutting carbs, maybe 1 to 3% from cutting fiber, and then whatever's left, they have to sweat. And so they will cut fluid completely for about 24 hours before weighing, and then they're going to do a sweat, using whatever method they prefer. So whether it's a sauna or a hot bath. A lot of the athletes in China like to work it off, so they'll like throw on the sweatsuits and jog on a treadmill for a bit. We try and discourage that. Like we don't mind them doing a little bit, but you certainly don't want somebody trying to run off 3 or 4 kilos when there's easier ways to do it. So that's kind of our approach, and to kind of put it all together as well. Like the amount that we like guys to lose is about 10% of their body mass through acute means. If they're 10% above their weight division, 7 to 9 days out, we're pretty happy with them, and that we can do it all acutely, and it's not, we're not worried about them. When they get above that, when they're 12% above their weight division, 7 to 9 days out, we're starting to get a bit worried. And with females, we could probably talk for a long time as to why this is the case, but it seems to be that those recommended percentages above weight division should be dropped by 1 or 2%. So 10% for a male seems to be a lot easier than 10% for a female. So we'd probably rather the girls be about 8%. And so that's the best practice. We can talk about some of the, um, more harmful methods that people use if you like, but I think I've waffled on for a bit, so you let me know.
No, no worries. Well, listen, in terms of the females with having that lesser, that 8% range, in your opinion, any particular reasons why that would be lower in females than men?
Yeah, I mean, I th like, um, so generally females are not going to be as lean as males, and therefore they're not going to be carrying as much muscle mass at a given weight. So, and we know that muscle is water, so there's less water for them to lose. Also, they're probably storing less glycogen, given the fact that glycogen makes up a certain percentage of kind of skeletal muscle weight. So right there, you've got kind of you know uh, total body water content and total glycogen content. And then also females tend to have higher or what's the word I'm looking for? The onset of sweating doesn't occur until later in a kind of thermally challenging environment,
Hmm.
and their sweat rates are lower as well. So even just those factors before you even get into the hormonal differences, which certainly could play a role. That in my mind would easily explain 1 to 2% of their body mass.
Tremendous. And Reid, you've obviously done a lot of work with water loading for acute weight loss. How does that fit into the equation? Are there still aggressive water loading strategies that are used with some professional fighters? Is it more, as you mentioned, when you get that 10% range and you've hit those fundamentals leading up to fight night, you should be in a good situation? How does that shake out?
Yeah. So I think of it as another tool in the tool belt, and people have made weight for years without using water loading, and they're going to make weight for years without using water loading. So I certainly don't think it's a mainstay of a acute weight loss program. However, what we say to our fighters, and it is very popular in MMA, even Chinese MMA, it's really popular. Um, we give them a recommended water loading protocol based on the research that we publish because we know that that's safe, or at least in the context that we used it. Because obviously there's a risk of hyponatremia if you're consuming all this,
For sure.
extra water. So we kind of give them those guidelines where we say maximum, 100 mil per kilogram, so 70 kilogram athlete, 7 liters per day. And we give them that protocol just so they've got some numbers to work with. But some people don't like doing the water loading or can't do the water loading. So our message to them is like, hey, here's a protocol that you can use. Whether you use it or not is up to you. But what we recommend is that you keep fluid high, because what we don't want is them cutting out fluid too early. Um, and thankfully, most MMA athletes, I think, get this message, but certainly like boxers and wrestlers, there tends to be a culture, to like water taper, where maybe the last week, they start cutting out water 5 to 7 days out, like not completely, but they start to, stepwise reduce their fluid consumption. So our message around the water loading is that, hey, here's water loading if you want to do it. If you're not going to do it, please keep water high until that kind of 24 to 36 hours prior to weigh-in.
Tremendous. And obviously, if we stick on the topic of water and hydration crucial for performance, both physically, mentally. We would think with combat sports, obviously tremendously important as well. In some of the work that you've done in the past, whether we're using things like specific gravity with a urine dipstick, or whether you're using other more advanced methods for assessing hydration, how good or not so good are some of these methods in informing your practice?
Yeah. So I think urine-specific gravity certainly has utility. I don't think it's like I wouldn't be prescribing specific fluid intake recommendations based off it, but certainly where I see the real value in our urine-specific gravity is number one is identifying athletes that have a problem, just with hydration in general. Like if we're doing USGs all throughout a week And, if some people are borderline what the kind of published guidelines would say is acceptable, maybe we don't worry about them, particularly if everything seems to be going well. But if you've got a guy who's consistently, 1.03305 or whatever it is, like definitely dehydrated consistently, then that helps us identify that guy. But aside from helping us, what I think it is really great education for the athletes. And so, it just kind of gives them a number, and specifically the way we do it is, make an Excel report for them where we have, colors like a green, yellow, red traffic light system, and gives them those colors. So if they see that they're in the red every day this week, and then they start drinking a bit more and they see that color change from red to yellow to green, it develops really good buy-in with the athlete. Whereas maybe if you're just telling them to drink more, and then they drink more, and there's no change for them in terms of the way they're performing or whatever. It's a little bit harder to sell that message. So I definitely see it as a great education tool. There's a lot of problems with it in terms of, actually, particularly people that are kind of close to these cutoffs in determining whether they are dehydrated or not. And we kind of published a review paper which highlighted a lot of these concerns. So that's USG. And then some of the better ones, of course, is like plasma sodium, but we certainly don't use that in routine practice. But in terms of research setting, it's likely better than USG, right?
Absolutely. And obviously we'll include all the links to your work here in the summary notes for the podcast here. And, having worked in this domain for so long, and the Gatorade Sports Institute, growing up as a fighter yourself, mixed martial arts, BJJ, and now with the UFC, what are some of the things that you've learned, whether it's from the athlete side and then informing the practice, or vice versa, and working with elite athletes over that time?
Yeah, I mean, this is true in all sports nutrition, but really, really important with fighting sports. You have to get buy-in. You have to show these athletes that, number one, you're on their side, you understand them. You need to learn as much about the culture as possible. I would say, like, there's got to be exceptions, but I would say the vast, vast majority of people that are successful in this space have got experience in it. And there's no better way to understand the culture of a sport than to do the sport. But aside from MMA, this applies across the board. You've got to get buy-in. You've got to convince the athletes that that what you're on about, that you've got their interests at heart, and that you're on their side. And sometimes you have to let things go. You've got to pick your battles. You can the athlete comes in with a list of 15 different supplements that that 14 of them are rubbish. But you've got to kind of bite.
Can't throw them all away at once.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to kind of get some wins up your sleeve with them first before you can talk to them about the supplements. And like the weight cutting is a really good one, because a lot of people have got these crazy old school methods of doing it, and then you show them a more structured modern approach, and that's instant feedback when they do the weight cut, and it was easier, and they made weight like it was just a walk in the park compared to the way they've done it in the past. That's going to get you that buy-in to then talk to them about the supplements. So that's one, is that buy-in is very important. And then the other thing that I've learned along the way, and what my PhD kind of focused on, and what I talk about whenever I speak to kind of up-and-coming nutritionists and dietitians in this space, is the need to be pragmatic. And this is more so true in combat sports because of the weight cutting than in other sports. But there's optimal, and then there's realistic, and it's like you've got to get the job done, and you definitely, I wouldn't even say may need to sacrifice optimal. I would say in every situation you're sacrificing what you think might be optimal in order to get the job done with the specific athlete in front of you. And a classic example of this is just weight cutting in itself. Like, all of the health professionals, I mean, I'm saying all, that's generalizing, but a lot of the health professionals and medical boards and all this would say that weight cutting is crazy. People shouldn't do it. You should walk around at the weight that you fight at, and all the rest. But people winning world championships in weight category sports do not walk around at their weight division. And athletes know this, and there's definitely a performance benefit to cutting weight. Now, it's not to say that the more weight you cut, the better, but certainly if you're not cutting any weight, and you're competing in a sport with a window between weigh-in and competition of 24 to 30 hours, there's ample opportunity to cut and recover weight. And if you're not doing it, you're giving an advantage to your opponent. So you've got to be pragmatic and understand the kind of realistic nature of what's going on. So I'd say the biggest things is get buy-in with the athletes and be pragmatic.
It is amazing how in skill-based sports, and obviously a lot of tremendous amount of skill in combat sports, that oftentimes a lot of those really talented athletes, as you mentioned, for us in basketball, tall, great vertical leap, fast, and it can be tricky to build the buy-in sometimes and to get that. Definitely not the ideal approach, as you mentioned, to trying to pick your battles and lay down those foundations and be pragmatic, because you really just you got to move that athlete in the right direction. And in team sports, obviously, we tend to have more time. In combat sports, you guys are up against time pressure as well. And Reid, if we talk about the evolution of research, the evolution of performance in mixed martial arts, where do you see some of the, without giving away any trade secrets, where do you see some of the next best gains coming in the next 5 or 10 years or so?
Yeah, so I had to think about this when you sent through kind of somewhat we'll be talking about, and in terms of the weight cutting space, something that we've been really interested in lately, and we're going to continue to kind of play around with, but I'd love to see some research specifically in weight category sports coming out, is heat acclimation. So heat acclimation research has been extensively studied in terms of team sport athletes and endurance athletes performing in the heat. One of the heat acclimation adaptations is the lowering of the sweat onset threshold and also increasing the sweat rate that occurs. So what we're toying around with and having success with some athletes is acclimatizing them to the heat, so that then when they go to do the final weight cut, they're actually cutting more weight in the sauna quicker and with lower RPEs associated with it and things like this. But so far, there's been no research which has actually looked at it in the context of weight cutting. It's all kind of performance based. So we want to get into that, and I'd be really interested for anybody else to get into that. The other stuff, the other areas of research that I see promise in is number one, periodization. So periodization has been extensively studied in other sports, but looking at the integration between kind of the technical aspects of fighting and the non-technical. So your S&C and your versus wrestling and boxing and this sort of stuff. Like, how do you tie it all together? And is there better and worse ways to do it? And then the last kind of area that's kind of really interesting to me and others that I work with is just looking at kind of coaching and feedback that you give athletes, and the way you speak to athletes and the best way to coach, because there's a lot of kind of skill acquisition literature which says that random versus block practice is much better, and other positive versus negative feedback and all this sort of stuff. But if you looked at the way that a lot of combat sports coaches coach, it's probably counter to a lot of what the evidence base says. So to determine whether all this stuff applies to combat sports would be really interesting, and then to kind of take it further and look at what ways to improve coaching in this space, I think would be really valuable.
Amazing, Reid. Well, listen, I appreciate you carving out so much time today. We're gonna make sure we have all the links there to your research on the page that hosts this. If people want to stay connected with you, with your work at UFC and some of your past research, where's the best place for them to do so?
Yeah, I'm really bad at social media, but I've got an Instagram account that I rarely post anything, and that's just my name, Reid Reale. People can look at that. But in terms of the research, it's probably just Google Scholar. You can just search my name, and also ResearchGate I'm on as well. I've also got a Facebook page, Combat Sports Nutrition, which I don't really tend to either. So people can follow all those channels that I don't really engage with.
There you go. Follow the UFC if you want to follow with Reid. Amazing, man. Listen, I really appreciate you carving out some time today, and look forward to keeping up with all the great work you guys are doing.
No problem. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invite. It's been a real pleasure to appear on your podcast and keep up the great work.